Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. and today I'm reviewing Massive Darkness 2 Hellscape from Command Games. Massive Darkness 2 is a 1 to 6 player dungeon crawling experience, although if you are playing it at 6 players and having a good time, let me know. I kind of think of this as a 1 to 4 player dungeon crawling experience. Again, you can definitely play it with 5 or 6, just feels like it wouldn't work quite as much that way. But that's neither here nor there. Let's go ahead and dive into this conversation. This is a 1 to 6 player dungeon crawling experience. This is based on the original Massive Darkness that Command put out quite some time ago, with a lot of the core systems at play still present, with a ton of differences such that if you didn't like that one, this still very well may be a game for you. And if you did like that one, I think this can only be an improvement. I could be wrong with that. If you like the original Massive Darkness and not this one, let me know in the comments down below. But with that said, this is a dungeon crawling experience. It's going to have one-shot modes. It's going to have a campaign mode if you do get the additional expansion that, well, gives you a campaign mode. But past that, you're going to be having 1 to 6 characters in play. Even if you're not playing with 6 players, you could have 1 to 6 characters in play that you're going to be going through these dungeons with. You're going to have that one-shot mode, and you're going to have the characters as they start off in the game, and you're trying to accomplish your specific scenario goals and accomplishments as you go through it. Whether it's trying to, escort somebody to a location, whether it's trying to take down all the baddies. It's rarely take down all the baddies. It's usually some other thing along the way as far as how you're getting your heroes to a place, trying to deliver different things, go to the altar and transport there, carrying a giant sword that burns you every single time you touch it. There's a variety of scenarios you can go ahead and dive into, and then of course, as long as you get expansions and all that, there's going to be more and more scenario content. Plus, I think there's free scenarios online. The general idea of it, though, is this is going to be a rampaging, dice-rolling, dungeon crawling experience. You're going to have your characters, and a big drive of the game is the high asymmetry of the characters. The base game comes with 6 different characters, all of which have the same basic, how they're going to move and activate and all that, but they all have their own little mini games to play into. You're going to have the wizard who's trying to manage a bit of a rondel as their spells cycle every single round, and there, let me go ahead and grab this over here. You have a little spell cycle thing that's going to be moving around round to round, and every single round you're rotating this as far as you're moving to different spells, and as you level up in the game, you're adding more spells to the board, so you're trying to time how you're going to activate your spells and in what order as you go through the experience. You're going to have your ranger that has a push your luck deck building experience. The ranger is going to be, every time they shoot with a ranged attack, they're going to start drawing these arrow cards, trying to see if they can get the exact right amount of arrow pips on their shot, alternatively getting a perfect strike, not strong enough, but still some benefits, or overshooting and losing some of the benefits as they go. You're going to have the paladin who creates these consecrated zones on the board, who's going to help the other players by putting down zones where they can heal, shoot, and then leveling up by adding more cards to these various zones, so as he places these zones on different places, they have different abilities as you go through the game. You're going to have the berserker who likes to take damage and uses the damage that he or she takes to drive home just how much damage they can do as they switch between different forms in terms of defensive, offensive, running across the board, and again, powering all those up as you go through while trying to take damage as you go. You're going to have the shaman that's going to be trying to manage different mana pools, that different kind of symbology things that you're going to be using to power your resources and these spirits as you go. And then you have the rogue, the last one. I think that's all 6. The rogue is going to be the last one, who has their own little bag building puzzle that they're pulling these tokens from a bag to drive in these extra actions. Those are going to be the 6 present in the base game, and expansions add, I don't know the exact number, but like another 5 or 6 different classes of different abilities, necromancers and monks and all these other classes you can dive into, although this review very much is focusing on the base game. Each of these characters brings their own asymmetric puzzle as you wander around the dungeon. You're going to have your dungeon maps that are going to be a bunch of these tiles, these typical Command 3x3 tiles that give you a little bit of a puzzle to move and navigate as you're mindful of the various doors you're going to be opening, the treasures are going to be there, the various enemies that will spawn as you open doors, some of which will be essential because you need to open the door to accomplish the quest, and other times there'll be decisions as far as, hey, that room looks like it has 3 or 4 treasure pieces, but it also has 2 mobs, and those mobs might present a challenge as we go, but we might need the experience to actually level up as we go through the scenario, so what's the balance as we try to be mindful of that? The game very heavily focuses on the idea of light and dark zones in the game. You're going to have zones of light, and you're going to have dark zones, and you are stronger in dark zones, which gives you a lot of the puzzle of the game is going to try to figure out how to make sure you're taking your attacks in those dark zones because you're simply stronger when you do so. You're going to be rolling a shadow die that's going to give you more strength, but also many abilities in the game will play into being able to be more effective as you do things in the dark zones in the game. You're going to be going through the dungeon and slowly powering up as you take on different mobs. As you go through the dungeon, as you open up different doors, you'll be turning over these door cards that will give you some sort of, event effectively that happens as you open a door. But then whenever there's a token for a mob, you're going to be spawning mobs based on the level you have. Until you dive into the campaign, you have levels 1 through 5 over here, 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 5. The campaign introduces high levels as you go through, and you're going to add a mob to the game. The mob is going to have their health stat, the treasure that you loot from them, and they're going to draw a random item from their appropriate level as well. That's going to give them effectively a weapon that they're using as they go ahead and attack you in the game. The stronger you get as you level up, you're going to go ahead and increase the levels of the mobs as well. The mobs are going to get stronger as you get stronger to try to make sure that the difficulty is there as you go through the experience. But that's not all, because there's also a clock on the board, and this clock slowly ticks along and is going to pull roaming monsters into play. There's giant roaming monster cards that'll give you all these different abilities as far as what they're trying to do and how they're going to take out. It's worth noting as I shuffle through these that I have mixed in all of the various extra content, so some of the stuff you're seeing here may not be base game content, but you're going to have these roaming monsters that are trying to hunt you down. Those roaming monsters present a greater threat with more health and more damaging abilities as they try to take you down. Ultimately, it's up to you to try to figure out how to combine your heroes, combine the asymmetric abilities of the heroes, the unique aspects of your heroes, because one thing I really touch upon is even though they have asymmetric ability, even though they have different classes, even within the classes there are multiple heroes as you dive into expansions and more content, which means you can have a wizard, but there might be multiple versions of a wizard with different slight nuances to how they approach it while utilizing the same class-based asymmetrical roles in the game. You're doing all of this, moving through the dungeon, you're trying to be mindful of shadow zones, you're opening up doors, you're spawning mobs of monsters, you have roaming monsters slowly trying to hunt you down, and you're trying to accomplish your goals while ultimately trying to stay alive with a fairly limited health pool that you try to be mindful not to lose too much as you tactically outmaneuver the mobs in order to win in Massive Darkness. That's the core idea of the game. Past that, combat in the game is going to involve you rolling handfuls of dice. You're going to be looking at your enemy stats over here. And I'm going into like more high-level stuff, not going to all the rules. But as you go through here, if you have a mob, you're going to, when you attack a mob, you're going to be mindful of your gear and what weapons you roll based on your gear. So for example, this one over here lets me roll 1 yellow and 1 orange die. But if I'm attacking from a shadow zone, I roll an extra orange die, which is going to help over here. By the way, the yellow and orange, when the marble dice in particular, not as obvious as I'd like, but that might be a marble dice problem. You're going to go ahead and roll that, but you're going to have to go ahead and roll their defense. If I'm attacking these skeletons over here, they have 2 defense dice, but you also have to add dice for every single miniature they have. Not miniature, every single minion they have. There's a leader miniature and then minion miniatures, and you roll extra attack dice for every single minion miniature. You go ahead and roll all that. That actually has a decent roll over here. They got none of their minion miniatures having any damage. Those can either activate abilities sometimes or deal damage. And in the case of skeletons, that adds more skeletons to the mob if you're not careful. They rolled 2 defense. I rolled a 6 offense. It's going to be 6 versus 2. That's going to be 4 damage, which means I'll kill 1 miniature entirely and have 1 overflow damage onto the next, while also generating a magic. Had they rolled this, they would deal 1 damage to me, but also add a skeleton to the mob unless the attacking hero discards a mana. So you're going through this puzzle of every single character having different activation as you figure out how to roll giant handfuls of dice and activate your abilities in order to take down the mobs and eventually accomplish your goals in Massive Darkness 2. That's most of what's going on in the game. There's more things I could dive into in terms of the various details, how things play out, but the overall idea is you have a bunch of asymmetric characters diving into a dungeon, taking out mobs along the way, rolling giant handfuls of dice, constantly grabbing weapons. You're going to be leveling up, you're going to be gathering so much gear in this game that not all of it will be a fit for you. In fact, most of it won't be, but you're going to be constantly drawing cards, adding them, eventually going to forges where you can go ahead and convert them into high-level gear or try to trade in gear that isn't working for you in the game. But you're doing all of that and just having a generally good time as you go through the experience, which means it's a good time to dive into the review, starting off with ease of play. This is a fairly accessible dungeon crawler. It's got a long rule book. It's got, I don't know, a typical command, 30 pages of rules, something like that, or, well, let's skip the scenarios over here. 34 pages of rules or so, but that includes the asymmetric classes, includes a lot of setup. This is an easy rule book to dive into and read. It's very, very high on the, all the images and all that. You can go through this, as far as comparing it to other dungeon crawlers, this is one of the more accessible ones that's easy to pick up and understand how to play this one. It's easy to get people up and running even faster. You can get someone, if someone has played another dungeon crawler and you're teaching them this game, once you teach them their own class, which is like a 5-minute, here's how your class runs, you can get someone up and running in this game in 5 to 10 minutes. As long as you're running the game, they can understand and pick up everything they need incredibly quickly. As far as game session length, it's going to vary heavily depending on the scenario you pick. You're looking at anywhere from 45 minutes on the low end, not the tutorial. The tutorial's like much shorter than that, but I'd say 45 minutes on the low end, maybe half an hour if you're really powering through or playing it solo or something, but you can go upwards to several hours on the longer scenarios that are going to give your character more room to level up and grow. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking in this game, overall, this is an excellent dice rolling dungeon crawler, and it's all about the fun of it. This game is more focused on rolling handfuls of dice and having fun than most dungeon crawlers that are coming out nowadays. Most dungeon crawlers nowadays are very focused on strategy, or the 15 levels of depth that they bring to the table, and the tons of classes and 700-page rulebooks, and I'm exaggerating a bit, but this is one of the more accessible dungeon crawlers that I've played in recent years that leans heavily into just, hey, roll dice, have a good time, level up, gather gear, play your little asymmetric role that gives you, like, there's so much reason to dive back into this game time and time again because of the variety of characters, monsters, scenarios, gear, all of that stuff is just present to give you a fun dungeon crawling experience. There's a lot of variety in the loot. There's a lot of variety in the characters. There's a lot of variety in the way everything combines. And there's a lot of variety in the way, even if you're just picking the same characters you've dove into the game before. Playing with a ranger and a wizard and a paladin is going to be a very different experience than playing with a ranger, a shaman, and a rogue. It's going to be very different as far as the approach you take to try to manage the mobs of monsters and miniatures heading your way in the game. It's easy to pick up. It's easy to play. It's just rolling lots of dice and having fun with powers and abilities, both on the monster side and on the character side as you go into it. This game leans heavily into the concept of, hey, we're going to roll dice and have a good time. It is accessible and fun, and it does a good job at all of that. You're going to have hordes of miniatures approaching you, and you're going to take them out and feel powerful doing so. I have caveats, we'll get to them soon, but overall this is just gather items, roll dice, level up, monsters level up with you, more monsters are spawning, more enemies are attacking you. The larger missions are a ton of fun as far as giving you just the larger and longer experiences that will give you more room to explore your character's growth, to level up your character, and to figure out just how many hordes of miniatures you can take out as you go. And then dealing with the various bosses as well. We haven't really gotten to the bosses. The bosses have their own little way that they're dealt with. Here we can have a little board over here. Let's just show you briefly. But those, again, provide an additional challenge in the game as you go through it. There's just a lot of different things between the bosses, between the mobs, between the roaming monsters, and between the powers and abilities and the asymmetric classes. It's just fun. It's just a fun game. That's what it is. It's just a fun game. As far as things I don't like there are a few, and the biggest one is the fact that the game in its base form, if you are not modifying things, the game is not difficult enough. It's just not difficult enough. This is something that, and this is one of those things where I double checked this one as well, because as I dove into this game more and more, I just found that it was one that I was having a cakewalk. I was going through the game and I was having a good time, but after, your fourth mission in a row where you just don't feel challenged by the experience, you start to wonder if you're playing it wrong, and heading online, it does seem like there's a general consensus that this game is just not difficult enough, and that's where you can throw in difficulty modifications that do enhance the experience. And they enhance the experience a lot. I'm going to throw together in the description, I'll throw in a list of those difficulty modifications that I've been using from a particular Board Game Geek comment that kind of aggregated all of them together in a single, here's all the things you can do. And I do recommend diving into those if you find this game is too easy. For one thing, I'd say that the 3-player count has been the most challenging as far as the modification. 3 characters, doesn't matter if players or not, but 3 characters, whether you're playing it solo, playing 3 characters with 2 isn't the most fun, which is part of the problem. But there are other ways you can modify the difficulty that, for me, have not detracted from the experience and have made this much more fun. I like what Massive Darkness 2 is doing, and I liked it from the first time I played it through every single game I played, but it definitely took me down a notch as far as how much I enjoyed it when I realized I wasn't feeling challenged so much as just walking through things and destroying them. Once you start adding in those difficulty modifications, it does significantly enhance the experience, and again, you can pick and choose the things that work for you, but if you're willing to do that, then it will approach those difficulty things if you find yourself having an easy time with the game. The other thing I'll say is that the game, especially if you have a lot of content, gives you a lot of miniatures and a lot of things from the original Massive Darkness, from expansions, and from all those things, and dealing with hordes of miniatures on the table, dealing with an organization system of how you're going to manage having, 17 different possible roaming mobs or whatever it is. There's a lot of miniatures and cards to manage in the game, which I wish gave me a little bit more variety. Now, the roaming monsters, those are amazing. The bosses, there's not even that many, but the bosses are amazing. The roaming monsters are amazing, totally fine. I'm always happy to pick out a new roaming monster from the box because they give you a different challenge as far as how you have to deal with them, with the caveat that once you level up the difficulty. The first few roaming monsters you have usually come down to mostly just being a health pool because you can take them out without actually having them activate that much or that frequently against you. Once you level up the difficulty, once you're dealing with high-level roaming monsters or you add difficulty modifications, that's less of an issue. But with the mobs, I think that the basic mobs, there's not a ton of differences to what one mob does versus another mob. There's always like these small little rules adjustments, and there are differences, but dealing with like having all the stuff for a few small differences that don't significantly enhance the way you approach them, it's a bit of a catch-22. Like you could just deal with having the the 6 or 7 mobs that are present. I think it's 6 mobs in the base game, and you could just have those in play, and that's fine. The more you add, the more variety you have, but it doesn't give you enough variety to almost feel worth it. So small little nitpick as far as how much content there potentially is and how much it leans into differentiating that content, at least when it comes to the basic mobs. Items, classes, bosses, roaming monsters, everything else is great. The basic mobs I wish felt more different. As far as I can see others not liking, first of all, the leveling up in the game is one of those things where if you're playing a shorter scenario, you might get to level 3, maybe level 4, and even then, not really level 4. I'd say that the earlier scenarios you're looking at level 2 or 3, well, past the level 2 or 3, level 2 or 3 for the earlier scenarios. Mid-game scenarios are level 3 or 4, and if you want to experience a full level 5 character and go through all the stuff it has to offer, you're usually looking at a 3-hour-long scenario of Massive Darkness. You're looking at a longer experience with a ton more to go through. This game kind of gives you a choice of either you don't see a ton of depth of upgrading your character, but you play a shorter experience, or you could see that depth, but you have to play a much longer experience to get through it. So it's a bit of a, pick your poison as far as how that goes. I'll say that finding loot sometimes, not often, but sometimes can be a frustrating experience. If you have a character that, let's say for instance, I've noticed this the most with the Ranger. If you're playing as the Ranger, there are times where you just don't find the right gear for the Ranger. You're trying to find a bow that you can use your ranged attacks on, and all you keep drawing are wands and swords, and it doesn't really help you, and you're left with a starting bow. That kind of thing does happen in this game. Not that often, but it can certainly be times where you'll get to a third of the way through the game or mid-game before you find a weapon that works with what your character is trying to do. So there is a ton of loot variety, but luck of the draw is a factor. And then lastly, setup and teardown. I do find that setup and teardown on this game is incredibly accessible when you're comparing it to some of the incredible dungeon crawlers out there, but I will say that it's still a lot. You're still dealing with all these decks of cards and these decks of cards and these tiles and putting it together. I would say that from the time you pull out your first box, depending on the content you have and what you're looking at anywhere from, on the fast end, I'd say 15 minutes to set up a game. Realistically, probably closer to 20, maybe on the fast end 10 minutes, but realistically, probably close to 15 to 20 minutes to set up a scenario, to deal with shuffling decks of cards and getting everything out and organizing all the stuff. Moving from game to game is faster. Teardown may take 5 minutes, and setup for the next game might take only additional 5 or 10 once you have everything out, kind of. But the basic idea of setting up a game, it definitely has setup and teardown in this, just because of how much content and stuff is going on in the experience. As far as final thoughts on Massive Darkness 2 Hellscape, I really like this game, and I am basing my rating for this based on modifying the difficulty. If you don't modify the difficulty to me, this is a 4 out of 5. It's a good game, it's a really fun experience, but it just doesn't have that crunch. For me, as it stands, though, it is easily a 4.5 out of 5, because once you do add that additional difficulty modification, once you make sure it is a challenge, and it does involve house ruling to a certain extent, which is why I'm kind of addressing both ratings there, because to me, the house rules are very easy. They are not significantly different. There's a whole list of options you can choose from as far as ways you can adjust it, and most of them have worked for me in different ways to make this game more approachable and more engaging, not more approachable, less approachable, and therefore more engaging as far as the difficulty goes. But it is a little weird to rate a game based on some house rules in play, but that's where I am with this. Massive Darkness 2 is incredibly accessible, it gives you powers and abilities, it gives you asymmetric characters, and as long as you're willing to play around with the rules and the difficulty to make it a game that works for you, which I have done, and I'll say that I've tried doing that in games in the past, and sometimes it works for me, sometimes it doesn't. I know with Zombicide Invader or Zombicide 2nd Edition, those are games that I tried changing the rules and making it more difficult, and I found it wasn't the experience I was looking for, even with all those changes, versus this has been an easy adjustment. A few rules change, picking and choosing what works for you here and there, and ultimately you have a dice rolling, powers and abilities, asymmetric characters, tons of variety, tons of depth, tons of content for this game, and one that I'm looking forward to diving into, like all the other things the game has to offer from different, bosses, campaign modes, and all those other aspects. I'm really enjoying Massive Darkness 2 Hellscape from Come On. It is one that takes the original Massive Darkness experience that I did play and did enjoy and just makes it better. The original Massive Darkness had some issues with the fact that most things just came down down to a few stats here and a few stats there. There wasn't any innovation in terms of what equipment did. It was always like roll more dice, roll less dice, and that's kind of it. This game gives you a lot of ways to. You still have roll more dice and roll less dice, but you have a lot of other fun puzzles going on in terms of how you can take out and deal with the various monsters you're facing. And the biggest thing for me are those asymmetric classes. It means every single time I dive into the game, there's a new combination or puzzle I'm trying to approach. Even as I'm diving into new scenarios and fighting against new enemies, there's just a lot of variety and a lot of dice rolling and a lot of powers and abilities. And again, the big thing for me is you do have to adjust the difficulty a notch, but overall, I'm really liking this game. As far as other game recommendations, first of all, Cthulhu Death May Die. That's going to be one of my favorite dungeon crawlers of all time, and a game that I lose just as often as I win, and it's an excellent experience, awesome from CMON. And speaking of CMON, we also have Zombicide Black Plague. If you like the kind of things going on in any of these experiences, they all have a general overlap in terms of leaning into fun experiences, tons of variety of content, tons of powers and abilities, and different ways to approach you have a bunch of characters, you're facing off a bunch of miniatures, and trying to slaughter them all. All of them give you a different flavor and taste to the experiences, and all of them are very much games I'd recommend. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. Hope you found this review helpful, and as always, I hope you have a good one.